First, I want to go back to the original title, or the title of this conference, Miracle Worker, or I think you say magician, or an entrepreneur. And I think that everything we've heard so far today is telling us that there is a market, there is a business, there is financing that's available from different sources, but it is also a market in which is evolving very fast, and the evolution is quite confusing. Now, what I want to try to do is to bridge the gap between all this really comprehensive and really good information you've been given and the idea that you may be a young producer, someone who just set up business and wants to develop the business into something else. What sort of strategy can you have? The first thing I want to talk about is what I call essential skills for someone who is a film producer or a producer and wants to become an entrepreneur. The second thing, we'll go through possible type of development strategies for a business. And the last one, we'll talk about what I call the long view. Because frankly, the strategy that you're going to put in place is something that you will, and someone said it earlier, a strategy is not for 2 years, a strategy is for a very long time. And what you want to put in place is something that will last for the next 10, 15, 20 years for your company. So you need to have a vision, long-term vision. That's what I call a long view. The first business skill, and saying this, I'm assuming that everyone has basic financial skills. Frankly, going into basic financial skills would take another day. The first one is for a producer to have the ability to foster a good reputation. And it sounds really simple, but it's very important. You work in a business where you will work in a very small environment. You will almost always work with the same people. It will be extremely easy for anyone to know about your reputation. So if you have a bad reputation, it will affect you. Now, to have a good reputation, how to do this? Well, I've listed 4 things, and there could be more. They're the ones which I thought were important and that you need to develop in priority. The first one's pretty obvious. You have to be competent. Now, we've spoken about quite a number of things in terms of how to produce, etc. As they say, the devil is in the detail. You may have produced 1 film, 2 films, 3 films, and you may still not know your business. So every opportunity that you have to learn about it, do. And where you will be caught, quote unquote, is when you talk to someone, for example, a financier, they ask a question about insurance, and you don't know. You don't know what you're talking about. And, well, that is going to harm your reputation. The second skill that you need to do, the second way of having good reputation is to have the reputation of being honest. And I'm not talking about not stealing the money, that's obvious. When you go and pitch a project, don't go and lie or be economical with the truth with underlying rights. Again, that's unforgivable. You're wasting people's time, and they will remember it. The next one is be dependable, because if you're going to produce a film, you're going to make a commitment to do something. And that commitment is basically to deliver a product according to certain specifications at a certain time. And when you make that commitment, you need to be sure that you can do it. Now, it's easy to say, but we all know this is not exact business. So if you have a problem being dependable, you need to have the ability to deal with it. And dealing with problems generally is what will give you a reputation of someone who may not succeed all the times, but will be able to help people around him and not damage people around him when something goes wrong. It also, if you deal with problems, it means that you will be taking the lead when something happens. You will be offering solutions. You will be positive. And again, you may have a problem. It may go wrong. People will remember that you dealt with it very well. Second skill is about resources that you should assemble around you. And I'm not saying that you should, have plenty of people working for you. What you should do is have selected a number of people who you know in advance will be there to help you when you need it. We're talking of advisors, lawyers, for example, accountants who will help you with tax. We're also talking of bankers who will help you with financing. And these are people that you will cultivate at events like today. And it's very important that you know them in advance and that you talk to them about your problems and how they can help you. The second resource that you have is a core staff. If it's a company, you have people working with you. Those are the people who will help you when you have a fantastic project that starts to take off. They are the ones that you have to look after. They are the ones that you will hire again and again if you have new projects that come up. The next ones, assuming that you've done 1 or 2 productions, are suppliers. Say that you work on a film and something's gone wrong and you can't pay a supplier immediately. Deal with it, as I said, it's a problem. Take care of them. The next time round, they will be more willing to work with you than work with someone who basically let them down. And there are not that many suppliers in the business. They all talk to each other. So make sure that these people are there to back you, back your reputation when you have a big project. The last resource, I think, and that's probably much more strategic and much more important, that you really need to have around you is mentors, or at least a mentor. We're talking about someone who is very experienced, who's probably older than you, who is willing to share that experience with you, and who you can go to when you've got a problem. A phone call, someone is available. Now, those people exist. You meet them at events like here. They very often are willing to share their experience. You have to be, you have to be able to reciprocate also. If, for example, they help you on a film, maybe you will grant them an executive producer credit. Maybe you'll invite them at premiere, whatever. But it's very important because, again, they'll be the ones supporting you in the future. Next skill that you need to have is you need to have what I call management tools. Now, again, that's very obvious. But if you want to build a company, if you want to develop your company, you need to be able to have and to capture information about the business environment in which you operate. Now, how do you do that? Well, you read the publications, I don't know, you read the trade publications. You read the output of, I don't know, various, do you publish brochures on the industry in Poland? Well, you read those brochures, and they're really important. You also go to conferences and do networking. Now, this is for information that's publicly available. And as we all know, there's a whole side of the business that is not known publicly, and which is important to know about. This is why you assembled in your resources people like your lawyers, your accountants, your mentors, because they're the ones who will tell you, be careful, you're developing this project. I know someone else who's developing exactly the same one, or a very similar one, and there's not room on the market for 2 similar projects. Now, you also need to be able to know information about your own business and its own performance. Again, it's very obvious. You need to know about planning. It's either scheduling, and that will basically tell you what needs to be done and when, so what resources you need to have at that stage. You also need to know, of course, about budgets. And it's very obvious, how much is it going to cost and when. Next resource will be, you need follow-up tools. Basically, you will need, for your budget, for example, an accounting system. And it all sounds very complicated, very boring, no one wants to talk about it. You need to be able to choose an accounting system or to listen to the advice of someone who will choose it for you or help you choose it. And it should have 3 characteristics which are common to most of the tools that you need. It will have to be simple. You don't need to employ 25 accountants to do your accounts. It will have to be reliable. That's pretty obvious, but that's very important. And it will have to be able to produce the results in a timely fashion. There's no point knowing where you stood 6 months ago, today. What you want to know is where do you stand today. The last item in terms of management tool informing you about the performance of your own business is one which I've isolated, although in particular it would be part of the follow-up and the planning. It's cash flow. And the reason I'm doing this is that you have to remember when you go from being a producer in your capacity of producer on a particular project to being an entrepreneur, you take additional responsibilities and you have additional liabilities. And it is very important, if you do not monitor the cash flow of your company will go bust and you will be liable. Not only does it ruin your prospects in the future, but it could also ruin you financially. And that's not what you want to do, unless you do, but clearly you don't. And that's why I've put it into the essential skills. The last 2 ones fall under the category of get yourself organized. You're not producing a film anymore, you're running a business, and that's very different. Get yourself organized is number 1, is time management. If you're producing a small film, or if you're producing shorts or whatever, you might be able to do everything yourself. If you're running a company, if you're starting to produce several films, or to develop projects or ideas before producing them, you're going to have to be able to manage your time efficiently. Now, managing your time efficiently means, in practice, that you set aside some dedicated time windows or moments for specific tasks. For example, to review the performance of your company. Or, for example, to do some networking. Or to talk to your mentors. To step back from the day-to-day happenings of the business, to be able and have the ability to think about it and where you're going. This is the most difficult thing when you're an entrepreneur, is not to be swamped by the day-to-day. Step back and think about it. The second skill in terms of time management is to list priorities. Again, that sounds completely obvious, and it is. If you do that every day, every morning, or every week, or whatever, it will give you an idea of what is important today and what isn't. If you arrive on Monday morning, and on Wednesday you've got a very important meeting on which you stake the future of your company, it's actually a good idea to say, well, okay, I'm not going to do anything else. I'm going to prepare that meeting. That's time management. When you have listed your priorities, you also have found in the list of things to do, things that are actually not quite as urgent. And if you've started to assemble a small staff, or people to help you, or you have advisors, external advisors, what you're going to do is you're going to delegate those tasks. Now, delegating doesn't mean telling someone you do this. It means identifying a task, explaining it to someone who will perform that task, setting a deadline which fits with your schedules, and in your own mind, think of when you're going to go back to that person to verify that he or she is on track to perform. So you have to follow up delegation. Sounds like hard work, but it will save you ultimately a lot of time. the last skill, and it falls in the get organized category, is what I call housekeeping. When you produce a film, it's very easy to identify the paperwork that you need to keep and that you need to deliver, whatever. When you start running a whole business, it's a lot more difficult. More importantly, most businesses have a habit of looking from the point of view of the entrepreneur like a giant wave of paperwork that's going to swamp you. And you're not going to change the world, it's going to be like this. So you need to deal with it, and you need to get organized. So you need to know what to keep, and there are legal reasons why you should keep papers for a certain period of time, accounting papers in particular. You absolutely need to keep everything which is tied to ownership of the rights that you may have in the film. I'll get back to why later. You may have to keep documents for tax reasons. You may have a client or someone who's commissioned your film who will require some delivery materials. That's what you need to keep. You also need to think about how to keep it. Thank God the good old days of original documents signed and certified is disappearing. I hope it's disappeared here. And there's no excuse for not keeping documents in a digitized format. It costs virtually nothing. You can file your documents. They will be very easy to retrieve in the future. And if they're in the cloud, it's very unlikely they will disappear. Now, how do you want to use those documents? I think that you want to use them, if you've produced 1, 2, 3, 4 films, you actually have a whole documentation that you can use as a resource when you produce number 5. You can go back, check how a given contract was done, and you'll save on legal fees. You can go back and check what conditions you gave to an actor and have a stronger negotiating position. Going back to your experience is crucial, and that's the way you will develop your experience and capitalize on it. The second way that you can use it, and that's probably even more important, is that most films that you will do, at least the first ones, will be distributed by somebody else. That means that you will not be in control at all of the flow of cash or the flow of revenues. Now, if the film flops, it's unlikely to revive. If the film works, however, bear in mind that the distribution mandate will eventually expire, and you will eventually get some rights back. Or someone else will get them back, and you will be able to go and probe and require proper distribution, proper accounting, etc. If you don't have your paperwork, you can't do this, because you can't prove you own rights in the film. And it's really basic, but there are a lot of independent films that were successful 10, 15 years ago, on which today nobody can evidence they are entitled to the funds. And it's a complete shame, because you could finance the future of your company like this. The second part I want to talk about was possible development strategies for a company in the business. And bear in mind, I'm going to highlight 3 ideas. They're not mutually exclusive. The first one you could go for is producer for hire, what's known as producer for hire. I mean, I think we all know what it is. The goal is to generate revenues through producers' fees that you're going to be paid while you're producing for somebody else. The secondary goal, by the way, is that's the way you acquire experience. So everyone's probably started as a producer for hire, unless they have a very rich father, because that's the way you start. The difficulty you will find is that there are, of course, many more aspiring producers than projects to be produced. So you need to develop, and that is your basic strategy, a competitive advantage. So that friend who was at film school with you, who could produce the same project that you want to produce, you need to have to get better than him or her. Now, you can get better in basically 3 different ways. You can have more experience, but frankly, if you're trying to acquire experience by being a producer for hire, it's not going to be much help. Having more experience works, and there are film producers or TV producers who are specialized in basically difficult productions. They're the sort of people who make incredible amount of money. You never hear about them, and they save projects. And it's not a stupid business model, by the way. But they won't be the people who are known. The second thing that you could do is you have privileged relationships with people who are attractive to financiers who want to invest in films. For example, you have an incredibly good relationship with a talented director who will only direct a film that is produced by you. If the director is really talented, well, you've cornered that market. And there are cases like this. If you do a bit of work, and we'll talk about research later, if you do a bit of research, you'll find that certain directors only ever work with certain producers. And again, relationships of that type are, for a producer, a very good business model. Another way to make yourself indispensable, because that's what we're talking about, is you have identified a segment of the market in which you know more than your friends from film school. You understand a segment of the market better. Now, it could be kids' films. There are lots of people in this. It could be, I don't know, whatever example you can think about. A few years ago, a small number of producers had identified a corner of the market which worked really well, which was LGBT films. And I'm talking about 15 years ago. Think of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. Films that, if they had been made for a lesser budget, would not have crossed over into the general market or bigger market. And because these producers had the ability to explain the market, the ability to quantify it, to find the right talent, they managed to convince financiers, in that case was Polygram, to back the project, give it more production value, and break out. There are plenty of other examples. Think about it, do a bit of research on how people break through. But that's basically how you have a competitive advantage compared to your friend from film school who still wants to produce, but has no relationship, no capacity to develop a project in a market that he knows particularly well, and doesn't have experience. Basically, that person is not going to make very much money. Now, this sort of strategy has a number of pitfalls. The first one is you're effectively depending on somebody else. Your strength, unless you're the tough guy who rescues production because you have mega experience, of course. But otherwise, your future depends on the ability of a given director to last in terms of popularity. And contrary to what many people think, not all directors last. Some directors go stale. Now, if you've backed a director, had 5 really, really good films, was really hot, and started making really dull films, and it happens, your career is bound to be on the rocks unless you backed another director like this. And we'll talk about how to expand. If you are specializing yourself on highly specialized corners of the market, for example, I don't know, surfing. Surfing could go out of fashion. So there are dangers, there are pitfalls. The great advantage is that if you're doing this, if you're building yourself as a producer for hire, start building your company. You create your own credibility. You create a basis on which you could build something else. Now, something else is possibly the second type of strategy, which is where, as a film producer, you want to create an asset. Now, creating an asset is basically means that you want to own rights or retain ownership of rights in a number of films. And you want to make sure that those rights are valuable. And the reason you want to make sure that they're valuable is because one day you will retire and you want to sell those rights and cash in. Or you want to exploit those rights consistently, carry on exploiting them, and rake in the benefits from the distribution of your films. It's not exactly an original strategy. The big difficulty of that strategy is that for rights to be, fundamentally, for rights to be valuable, you need to control their destiny. Maybe not in the next 5 or 7 years, because to finance your film, you will have to pre-sell it or whatever. But eventually, you want to be able to get the rights back. Now, getting the rights back means that you will need some sort of form of distribution to exploit them yourself. Forms of distribution that you might need, and it's not terribly expensive to set up, is a sales agency that specializes in, let me take a stupid example, Pedro Almodovar's films, or Mike Leigh films, or that's what the sort of market in which you've worked. And those agencies exist. There are people who spend their lives selling films like this. They're very well-known, high-profile films. If you own those rights, the way you increase your revenues and you increase the value of your assets is to set up distribution. Now, part of the problem of setting up your distribution is that very quickly it will appear, and your fabulous director or your fabulous actors, whatever, will tell you, well, why sell the rights in the film that we're about to make? Why don't you distribute it yourself immediately? So you're going to move into first cycle distribution. And again, you can still do it with a sales agency. The problem is it's a lot more expensive because financing films traditionally, and we've spoken today several times about it, films are traditionally financed on the basis of how much cash they can make, how much revenues they can generate. The simplest way is what's known as a pre-sale. It's an advance on future revenues. Now, if you're going to distribute yourself, you're going to have to put up this money. Now, again, you don't have a rich father who can help you. So you're going to have to acquire some financial skills which will allow you to attract money to help you finance your own films. And the more you're able to do it, and it's quite difficult, to be perfectly honest, to acquire the skills. I'm not even talking of meeting the wealthy financiers who will back you. The more successful you are at this, the more valuable the rights that you will be able to retain. Now, that's pretty clearly the way you build a big library, highly valuable library. The main pitfall of all this, apart from the fact that you need to find the money, the main pitfall of this strategy is that it is a long-term strategy, which is very high risk. Because as we all know, when you make films and when you finance films, even if you're extremely competent, even if you're very careful and cautious, accidents happen. And smaller companies or medium-sized production companies cannot afford too many accidents. The second reason it's a risky long-term strategy is that you need to have the ability as a company to survive even when you don't have projects for 2 or 3 years. You need to have the ability to survive and not to take on projects in which you don't believe and that you do not want to back. And generally speaking, once you've embarked on that sort of strategy, which is financing your own movies, it's very difficult to go back to being a producer for hire. You can go one way, the other way is very difficult. So once you're embarked on that way, you don't know where you'll end. And by the way, there are people who've been extremely successful doing this. The third type of strategy, and again, they're not mutually exclusive, is what I call integration or diversification. Now, integration is often known as empire building. Diversification, I think everyone knows what it is. Now, the goal is that you look at your own business, your own company, which, remember, you launched it a few years ago, it's grown. You look at it and think, well, actually, why should I subcontract some of my activities to, I don't know, a distributor in Poland, a film distributor in Poland, who's going to make big fat fees on my back? So you're going to start setting up theatrical distribution. Or you're going to say, well, why do I pay big fat fees for someone to develop a project for me? I'm going to start my own development unit. And that basically is when you do this in a given value chain. In that case, I was taking the example, and naturally it's my background of films. What you could do is say, well, actually, I want to stay in Poland. It's a really nice market that I know really well, but it's not an expanding market at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move sideways and go from films into TV production, or from films into games, or into animation. And you're trying to think of connected markets. And they're connected because they're in the media, in the media industry. They're creative industries. They have a lot of common skills, a lot of common financiers. Now, the difficulty of doing this is that every time you move sideways or every time you move up or down in the chain, you're starting a new business. And that will require very specific management skills to be able to be a repeat entrepreneur without saying the previous business. So either you find someone to delegate to, or you start multitasking, but there's a limit to this. It also requires pretty important resources on the whole, and we'll see in the examples I want to give, one where the resources were virtually no limit. But it can be extremely successful, and there are companies that develop like this. The two pitfalls that you can have, the main ones, are you're diluting your competence. And if you've gone into being a film producer because you're in love with films, you may not want to develop games, video games, or you may not want to do animation or TV. It's for you to know what you want to do. And no one, by the way, ever said that your strategy should be to grow and grow and grow. Maybe at some point you say that's enough. I want to stay in my niche market. The second thing is it's very costly if it's not well planned. Because, again, the price of failure is extremely high. If you create theatrical distribution, for example, you're a film producer in Poland, do you create theatrical distribution? You will very quickly see that your theatrical distribution outfit does not work only with your output of films. So you need to start distributing films for somebody else. So you're going to have to start putting up maybe advances to buy the rights and maybe P&A funding. You keep raising the financial stakes. And there are only so many flops you can resist. And the more diversified you are, the more the flops will come, because it is diversified. It's sort of the way it works. Now, I've prepared a list of people that I think are probably reasonably good illustrations of those type of strategies in a mix and match way. And I mean, we can talk about them, you can ask questions if you want, but what I'm suggesting actually is that people research them yourself. I'll explain to you why later. Now, the first one is someone who is a New York-based producer called Christine Vachon. Despite the French name, she's American. Her company is called Killer Films. And she launched her company with producing films that were directed by Todd Haynes. Now, they were at film school together, and they've expanded from there and she's today a very experienced, almost a grande dame of film producing in New York. The second example is a British example, Jeremy Thomas. Now, incidentally, Christine started, the start of the model was the producer for hire. She slowly created her company. She owns more and more rights. She's had problems of financing a few years ago, and she started moving sideways. And she's actually moved sideways in a very interesting way. She's moved sideways into talent management, which for a producer, if you think about it, is not stupid, because that's a skill that you acquire when you've been a producer for 20 or 30 years. Jeremy Thomas, his company is called Recorded Picture Company, and the sister company is called Hanway Films. Recorded Picture Company is a production company. Hanway Films is a sales agent. He's extremely well known. He's today in his mid-60s. He's produced films like Bertolucci, Cronenberg, etc. The body of work is actually impressive. The way, again, he started, producer for hire, he had an insight into the business because his father was a director, a very well-known director. So he was helped into the business at the beginning. The extraordinary thing is the intelligence with which he has assembled a library which is absolutely impressive in its quality. When you look at a film library generally, you have 20% of interesting titles. I'd say in Jeremy's library, you're talking 80% of interesting titles. That's, yeah. Next one is a company called Fandango Film. It's an Italian company. Domenico Procacci, who again started producing films slightly more as a producer for hire, very quickly became a proper production company, started to assemble rights, and very quickly, rather than build a library, actually focused on expanding sideways. So you have cinemas, you have distribution companies, you have a publisher, a book publisher. I think he's got a video and on-demand platform, and I can't remember what else, but I mean, it's quite impressive. And it works. Financially successful, extremely well-defined in its own market. Really high-quality films. Zentropa, I suppose everyone knows Zentropa, so no need to get into details. Now, an example in France, which is a company that has survived for a very long time. It was created in the 50s, Les Films du Losange, and it's run today by someone called Margaret Menegos. The company was created by the two directors who were, the gods of the new waves in the 50s. One of them, I don't know if it was greater, Roma was. They have maintained all the way through that consistency of high-quality films and the sort of people whose films they produce. Today they produce Haneke's films. So you're talking high quality. And they've built a business specifically on art films. That is extremely impressive. I want to take two other examples which, if you knew who they were, would make a number of people cringe a bit. These are people in this for the business, not really for the art. The first one is two people called Guy East and Nigel Sinclair, who've created a company called Exclusive Media. Now, for those of you who've been in the business for quite some time, they were also the people behind Intermedia. Intermedia was a big production distribution powerhouse, which was financed on the German stock exchange before it collapsed. It's really big. They've started again with Exclusive. Go and have a look at their bios and what they've done, because these are repeat entrepreneurs. They present themselves as producers. To some extent, they are producers. But they are, more importantly, entrepreneurs, people who know how to develop a business. And again, looking at other people's experience is not a stupid thing to do. The next one is someone called Elizabeth Murdoch. Now, Murdoch is like Rupert Murdoch. That's the daughter. She used to work for Rupert Murdoch at Biscay B, fell out with the business, well, the manager and her father. and 11 years ago created a film production company called Shine. She sold it last year for half £500 million. In 10 years, that's not bad. Now, of course, she invested a bit of her own money, not huge amounts. She was extremely good at identifying companies which she could take over for not a huge amount of money, integrate to build a pretty large film production. Was the largest, until it was sold, the largest independent film TV production company in the world. The way she's managed to attract and to grow is that she's managed to attract talent. Now, in TV production, talent is slightly different. It's the ability of people to develop essentially a format that works. And what she did is she checked these people, checked that the formats they had developed worked, bought them very quickly, and in order to buy them, made the offer irresistible. And she made the effort irresistible, A, because she's rather formidable when it comes to convincing people, B, because she had the intelligence of sharing her ownership of Shine, the head company, with the people she attracted. And that's a very, very, very good strategy in terms of growing a business. So I'd recommend, you will probably never sell your company for £500 million, and frankly, if you do, good luck, and well done. But in terms of development strategy, it is really very good. In 10 years, doing something like this is fabulous. Now, how to research, and if you remember, I spoke earlier that you need to have a number of resources. Well, we live in an age where researching is really easy. We all have the internet. Most companies advertise themselves these days through their own website, in which they will have, a section which is about or history and describe in their own words what they've done. And that's interesting because they tell you of their strategy. They won't tell you of their failures. They also do very often the same thing on Wikipedia, which is for many companies used as an advertiser. Behind these companies, you will find that there are people, and very often these people have Wikipedia pages too. Look them up. It doesn't take long. You should also check credits on IMDb, because that's where you will see who's got a relationship with whom and how they developed their business. Finally, there's the trade press, Variety, etc. They're all available online. It costs a bit of money, but frankly, you need to subscribe. Or I don't know, is there anywhere people can go to research on the internet in the documentation center? No? Yeah, it's not massively expensive. Yeah, yeah, and you're looking at Variety, you're looking at Screen International, basically, and just between those two, you'll be able to look at a lot of examples and to take inspiration from other people. And they've thought of things before. The last point I wanted to make is what I call the long view, innovation. Now, it's sort of a law of development of companies that a company develops if it works based on a good idea, dynamic people, it grows very fast. And between 7 and 15 years later, it sort of starts to plateau. And either it stays at that level, or it becomes mediocre and decays. Now, one of the reasons is that their competitive advantage may have disappeared. The director on whose work they were based has ceased to make good films. The sort of market they were going into has ceased to be relevant. Or they have not adapted to technology. They're still making feature films, for example. So the first point I want to make is you need to understand the impact of technology on the industry. Without going into too many details, basically, for the film industry, historically, you've got 3 types of change. In terms of technical change, where the advent of sound and the advent of color, and that basically has developed the audiences. And bear in mind, when that happens, it is still an industry which is based on theatrical. The advent of television, shortly in America, shortly before the Second World War, shortly after in Europe, it's changed the industry by giving it a new outlet, a new source of revenues. More importantly, it's changed the industry by giving it a much wider audience. Now, that much wider audience means that the product has had to change. There's been an implicit censorship in what you can say and not say. And if you look at films of the 50s, they're incredibly more conventional than what you would have seen in the 30s, or after the third event, which is the advent of video, where you now have access to niche markets. They're not mass markets. They require someone to purchase the film actively, so you don't have to tailor your film to fit everyone. Essentially, the other problem of video is that it's actually increased enormously the revenues of the industry. The consequence being that there's been an explosion in the cost of films because everything's become possible. That's how we came to make films that cost $200 million, which frankly is not reasonable. In terms of the impact of technology today, well, the truth is we don't really know. I mean, recently what happened is the advent of digital technology. Well, one of the impact is that making films is not quite as costly as it used to be. Do we know what the impact of video on demand on the industry is going to be? Well, that's what we were discussing this morning, and I don't think we do, actually. Nor do I think, in a second point, that digital distribution will be limited to VOD. The impact will go much beyond. And the question I want to ask is, how long is the feature film format going to be relevant? Now, I wish I knew at corner of the market. My bet is that for very big, spectacular event films, you know, the James Bonds of the world, it is going to be relevant because you want to go and see James Bond with your friends in a cinema. For smaller films, there's a big risk that it will not be relevant anymore, because the way smaller films are consumed by people is in their downtime. Now, your downtime is when you get home after a full day at work. Do you really want to invest 2 hours in watching a film that you don't really know very much about? It's doubtful. You've got another downtime, which is when you commute to work. And hopefully you don't commute 2 hours. Most people don't. So maybe the 90, 120-minute format is not going to survive very long for all films. You have to think about it. The last point about innovation, and again, those are points to be researched and thought about. The last point is, I think that you need to learn about different industry models, because we all see, in terms of films and television too, our own little world. And in terms of films, European and American is not the biggest industry. The biggest industry is Bollywood, by far. Bollywood is in India. The second biggest, which very few people know, is called Nollywood, and it's films made in Nigeria for African audiences. And we're talking about 50 films being made a week, so it's huge. We're talking of extremely cheap films that are distributed throughout Africa. To give you an idea of the sort of challenge and why I think it's relevant for people to go and look at it. A film that's made in Nigeria, from the time it is released, and it's not released in the cinema, forget it, it's on the shelves in the market on DVD. It takes 2 weeks for pirates to swarm the market. So the producer has 2 weeks to make his money. And they actually do. So these guys have some ideas, and it's worth looking at what they're doing. In terms of conclusion, I think that I want to go back to the title originally. Frankly, there's no point being a miracle worker or a magician if you are going to do something else. However, if you're well informed, if you're focused, and if you're flexible, well, there's a future as a producer and a producer entrepreneur.